Imagine for a second that you are, packing the trunk of your car for a quiet, relaxing family weekend out in the woods.
Right, just a standard trip.
Exactly. You've got the tent, you've got the sleeping bags, the marshmallows for s'mores, and the dog leash. It's just the absolute picture of domestic tranquility.
Yeah.
But then, right next to the camping stove, you pack a massive, heavy wooden cross.
Oh, wow.
Right. And into your GPS, you plug in the coordinates for what you essentially consider to be an active spiritual battlefield.
I mean, that is just a profoundly jarring juxtaposition to visualize.
It really is.
You're mixing this serene, low-stakes environment of a nature retreat with a highly intentional, high-stakes reconnaissance mission.
Exactly. And, well, that underlying tension is exactly what we are exploring today. So welcome to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We are unpacking a pretty fascinating first-hand account written by Joseph Bay. It's titled Spiritual Recon at Glastonbury, and it details this trip Bay took back in October 2024 with his two sons and their Jindo dog, Bobby. And what begins as a simple camping trip rapidly evolves into this intense exploration of contrasting spiritual landscapes, moving from ancient, foundational Christian roots to the very modern, very visible New Age and pagan practices of Glastonbury, England. It's late October. Bay's wife and daughter have opted to stay home, turning this into a dedicated boys' adventure.
Right, just the guys.
Exactly. They drive out to a campsite near Cheddar Gorge in Somerset. And because it's late in the camping season, the site is just completely abandoned. They're literally the only ones there.
Which provides the perfect blank slate for what Bay is trying to accomplish.
Yeah, so.
Well, because of the early dusk in late October, they are able to get a campfire going much sooner than they normally would.
Oh, true.
So they're sitting around sharing stories. The boys are roasting marshmallows and putting together s'mores for the very first time in their lives.
A huge milestone.
It is. And Bobby the dog is running around, adding this chaotic, playful energy to the mix. If you were looking at this from the outside, it is just a peaceful, isolated family moment.
But that peaceful image at the campsite, though, is really just the calm before a very deliberately planned storm.
Yeah, it really is.
Bay mentions in his account that he was heavily inspired by an experience at something called XCC and by a book by John Tyson called The Intentional Father.
Yep.
He isn't just taking his kids camping, you know. He is trying to engineer a real-life hero's journey for them.
And to understand his mindset, we need to define those influences. For context, XCC stands for Extreme Character Challenge.
Okay.
It is an intense, physically demanding wilderness endurance event designed specifically for men to explore their faith and push their absolute limits.
Wow, okay.
And John Tyson's book, The Intentional Father, it focuses heavily on the crisis of modern male initiation.
Interesting.
Yeah, the core philosophy is that boys don't just naturally stumble into resilient manhood, they need manufactured rites of passage.
They did that push.
Exactly. They need to be intentionally moved out of their comfort zones and dropped into an active narrative that requires them to actually face adversity.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that brings up a really interesting psychological dynamic.
Sure.
By combining a relaxing family trip with an intense, mission-oriented spiritual reconnaissance, isn't there a risk of putting entirely too much pressure on a simple weekend?
I see what you mean. Like, you're asking young kids who are literally just learning the mechanics of roasting a marshmallow to simultaneously step into a high-stakes spiritual battlefield. That just feels like an overwhelming amount of pressure.
It is a massive cognitive load, absolutely.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of a rite of passage, that pressure isn't a bug in the system, it's the entire point.
Oh, okay.
Psychologically speaking, controlled exposure to stress is how you build distress tolerance. If you only ever keep kids in the safety of the campfire, they never learn to navigate the dark woods just beyond the firelight.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Right. Bay wants them to feel that stark contrast between the safety of the tent and the tension of the mission.
And man, that transition from the safe training ground to the active mission field, it happens incredibly fast.
It really does.
The very next morning, they leave the quiet campsite in the rearview mirror and drive to the magnificent Wells Cathedral for the 8 Mirio a.m. morning liturgy.
And this is where the narrative really accelerates because of what happens during that service.
Yeah, tell me about this. Well, the New Testament reading assigned for that specific morning liturgy was from Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 18.
Ooh, no.
For those unfamiliar with biblical texts, this is the famous passage detailing the armor of God. It specifically talks about not wrestling against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces and cosmic powers.
I mean, you couldn't ask for more dramatic timing if you wrote it into a screenplay.
Right. To Bay, it entirely transcended coincidence.
Yeah.
He describes sitting in that ancient stone cathedral and hearing that text read aloud as a literal divine appointment.
Wow.
It was an external validation of the internal mission he had planned for his sons. It emotionally and psychologically primed them.
So they're geared up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They walked out of that cathedral feeling like they had just received their marching orders.
And they needed them, because right after that solemn, quiet cathedral morning, they make the short drive into Glastonbury.
Yes.
And they are immediately greeted by a massive sign proclaiming, and this is great, Glastonbury, home of Halloween.
Which is just wild timing.
Yeah, Bay admits in his writing that he hadn't actually planned for the Halloween timing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they basically wander into the epicenter of the UK's pagan and witchcraft communities on the single most significant weekend of their calendar year.
It's an incredible cultural collision. They step out of the car and onto the high street, and the presence of alternative spirituality isn't just a fringe element.
Not at all.
It is overt, and it is everywhere. Bay observes that there's this bustling, highly developed cottage industry that has turned the town into a pilgrimage site for New Age practitioners nationwide.
Yeah, he mentions that.
He walked down the main street and counted at least 20 different brick-and-mortar shops dedicated specifically to witchcraft, crystals, and esoteric practices.
It's just wild to picture this. I mean, this father and his two young sons walking down the sidewalk, completely surrounded by men and women, openly dressed in full wizard and witch regalia.
Yeah.
Bay estimates that like 70% of the people they encountered on the street were clearly involved in these practices. And he shares this wonderfully pragmatic detail about how they navigated the crowd.
Oh, the code word.
Yes, they didn't want to draw hostile attention to themselves or act afraid, so they invented a code word. They called the witches and wizards teas.
Tease.
Yeah. So as they walked, you just hear the boys discreetly whispering, "Dad, another pair of tees behind us."
That detail really highlights the sheer volume of the culture shock they were experiencing. I mean, they had to create a linguistic shorthand just to process the visual data of how many practitioners they were seeing.
It really is like wandering onto a movie set without having read the script.
Completely.
But let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Sure.
We are talking about Halloween weekend in a town already famous for its eccentricities. Is it possible that an observer who is specifically primed to look for spiritual warfare, especially after that Ephesians reading, might just be experiencing confirmation bias?
That's a fair point.
Right, like, couldn't he be mistaking a bunch of tourists having fun in Halloween costumes for actual practicing New Age adherents?
It's a very fair question to ask, and confirmation bias is a powerful psychological filter. When you're primed to see a battlefield, you'll naturally look for combatants.
Exactly.
But looking at the source material, the evidence points away from just temporary tourists. What Bay noticed was the permanent infrastructure.
The shops.
Right. You do not have 20 dedicated brick-and-mortar witchcraft shops surviving year-round on a single high street just to cater to one weekend of Halloween tourists.
That's a great point. The economics prove the culture.
Exactly. The shops are the year-round economic engine of the town. Sociologically, Glastonbury is one of the most significant hubs for modern paganism in Europe.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that prominent.
Oh, it's massive. So while some folks on the street might have been festive tourists, the underlying culture of the town is undeniably and permanently rooted in those New Age practices. So leaving that overwhelming modern scene on the street, you really have to wonder where someone like Bay goes to find a spiritual counterweight to all that neon paganism.
Right.
And this is where their reconnaissance takes a historical turn. They leave the bustling high street and retreat to the local museum at the Glastonbury Abbey site.
Yes, the Abbey.
They start digging into the area's ancient history as the Isle of Avalon.
What's fascinating here is that this is a crucial step in Bay's blueprint. To spiritually reclaim a space, he feels he needs to understand its foundational bedrock.
Makes sense.
At the Abbey, they focus entirely on a very specific, very ancient Christian heritage. The long-held belief that Joseph of Arimathea arrived in Glastonbury with 11 disciples in AD 63.
And just to clarify that history for a second, in Christian tradition, Joseph of Arimathea is the wealthy man who assumed responsibility for the burial of Jesus after the crucifixion.
Right. So the belief that he traveled all the way to Glastonbury makes this specific patch of land profoundly important. It represents the very foundational root of Christianity arriving in the British Isles.
Precisely. And for Bay, this deep AD 63 history serves as the absolute anchor for his worldview. It is the counterbalance to the 20 witchcraft shops down the street.
It kind of makes me think of a historical palimpsest.
Oh, what?
A palimpsest. You know those ancient parchment manuscripts where the original text was scraped off so new words could be written over it? But if you look closely, you can still see the faint original letters underneath.
Oh, yes. I love that analogy.
Right. Glastonbury is essentially a geographical palimpsest. You have this modern loud ink of Halloween and New Age culture written heavily over the town, but Bay is pointing his sons to the ancient, faded Christian letters that he believes are still the true text underneath.
That is a brilliant way to visualize his mindset, and it taps into a broader sociological phenomenon regarding sacred geographies.
How so?
Well, throughout history, we constantly see modern, secular, or alternative spiritual movements gravitating toward and repurposing ancient sacred sites.
I see.
Places that were historically significant for Celtic Christianity or ancient paganism often become modern hubs for New Age practices because they're perceived to hold residual spiritual energy, or maybe they lie on geographical ley lines.
But I do have to ask about the historical reality of that foundation.
Okay.
How much of that Joseph of Arimathea story is concrete, verifiable history versus, say, medieval religious legend?
Right, the academic debate.
Yeah, and does that academic distinction actually matter to a father on a spiritual mission with his sons? Like, is he looking for an archaeological fact? Or is the symbolism of the claim the true fuel for what he's doing?
From a purely academic standpoint, the Joseph of Arimathea connection to Glastonbury is widely considered by historians to be a medieval legend.
Okay, that's what I figured.
It was largely popularized centuries after AD 63 by the monks of the abbey, quite possibly to elevate the status of their monastery.
Classic PR move.
Exactly. But, to answer your second point, for a mission of spiritual reconnaissance, the symbolic power of the narrative absolutely trumps academic consensus.
Interesting.
The historical belief that the land was anciently consecrated to Christ provides the spiritual justification Bay needs to attempt to reclaim it. The legend provides the framework for his faith.
And they don't just attempt to reclaim it quietly in their hearts or, by reading a plaque in a museum.
No, they take action.
To physically and spiritually bridge the gap between those ancient roots and the modern surface, they decide to make a highly visible, incredibly physical statement.
Yes.
And they do it by hiking to the town's highest and most prominent geographical point, Glastonbury Tor.
This brings us to the absolute pinnacle of their trip, both literally and figuratively.
I can vividly see this scene in my head. The weather is glorious. Clear, crisp skies. But Bay and his two young sons aren't just taking a nice afternoon hike to look at the view.
Not at all.
They are carrying a heavy wooden street evangelism cross all the way up the steep incline of the Tor. And this cross is inscribed with the phrase, "Jesus is Lord," in both English and Hebrew. It is an undeniable, deliberate, visual testimony carried right into the middle of an environment that Bay feels is celebrating the exact opposite worldview.
Right. And carrying a massive wooden cross up a prominent hill naturally draws attention. It is a disruptive act.
Definitely.
But what stands out in Bay's account is a specific interaction they have on the ascent. A gentleman actually approached them, thanked them sincerely for carrying the cross, and told them he hadn't seen anyone carry one up there in 14 years.
14 years?
Yeah, he even asked to take a photo of them to document it.
Man, 14 years is a staggering amount of time for a site with such deep Christian roots to go without that kind of symbol.
It really is.
It really highlights how much the cultural landscape has shifted in that area. But they didn't just carry that cross up a quiet hill to take a photo. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
The moment they reached the summit and planted it to make their declaration, they realized they were sharing that exact peak with a competing worldview.
Right. They look over at St. Michael's Tower, which sits directly on the summit of the Tor, and they witness a competing spiritual reality unfolding in real time.
It is a complete split-screen moment.
Yeah.
Bay sees a group of New Age practitioners forming a tight, intentional circle right there at the base of the tower. They spontaneously burst into this loud, unintelligible chanting.
It's right there.
Right there. And as they chant, more of the teas, the witches and wizards from the town below, start hiking up and joining the circle.
Wow.
Bay notes that it really drove home the overtly pagan atmosphere of the space. As they eventually walked back down the hill, Bay and his sons are left imagining what kind of intense rituals are going to take place under that tower once the sun finally goes down on Halloween weekend.
It is the ultimate distillation of the town's dual identity. You have two completely opposing worldviews, both claiming historical and spiritual ownership of the space, forced to share the exact same small geographical peak at the exact same moment.
It turns the tour into a literal lightning rod for cultural tension.
Absolutely.
But looking at this, it makes me wonder about the mechanics of how we express belief today.
What do you mean?
Well, in our modern era, so much influence and communication happens digitally. It happens in subtle, invisible ways on our phones.
Right, yeah.
Why does the act of carrying a massive, heavy, physical object, like a wooden cross up a hill, still hold such profound psychological gravity? Not just for Bay and his sons, but for bystanders like the guy who wanted a photo, or even the chanters at the tower.
Because physicality demands a response in a way that digital content does not. You can simply scroll past a digital post you disagree with. But a physical cross, laboriously carried up a steep hill by a father and his children, forces a confrontation of realities in the physical world.
You can't just swipe it away.
Exactly. It interrupts the expected environment. Furthermore, for Bay, the physical exertion required to move the object validates the sincerity of the belief behind it.
That makes sense.
Sweating and straining under the weight of the wood transforms a theoretical theology into an undeniable physical reality. And, that theme of physical exertion seamlessly transitions into the final challenge of their trip.
Right, because after facing the spiritual peak of Glastonbury, they don't just go back to the tent and sleep.
No, they don't.
They head into a purely physical challenge that ends up perfectly mirroring their internal journey. Later that afternoon, they head over to the famous Cheddar Gorge. The light is fading fast, it's getting dark, and they decide to embark on this impromptu, incredibly steep climb up one of the rocky gorge faces.
And Bay notes that the path was uncertain, steep, and genuinely risky. It was a literal physical embodiment of the concept we discussed earlier, stepping from safety into the unknown.
And we can't forget Bobby the dog in all of this.
Oh, right, the dog.
Bay includes this great detail about their Jindo dog suddenly bounding ahead up the rocks, completely unbothered by the sheer climb. He says they had no idea Bobby had an inner mountain goat hiding inside him.
That's great.
It's this wonderful moment of levity and pure physical adventure in the middle of a very philosophically heavy trip.
It is a great moment of levity. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, back to the psychology of intentional fatherhood we discussed at the start, that climb was a vital mechanism.
How so?
When they finally reached the summit of the gorge in the fading light and sat down to share the snacks they had packed, they used the moment to reflect. The physical danger and the tangible accomplishment of that steep climb served as a metaphor for the spiritual path Bay believes they're called to walk.
It's like the Cheddar Gorge climb was a physical lab experiment for the boys.
Exactly.
They got to immediately test the theories of courage, resilience, and distress tolerance that they had just been learning about back on the tour.
Precisely. Physical exertion locks the philosophical lesson into their muscle memory. You don't just tell a boy to be brave. You put him on a steep cliff in the fading light and let him experience his own bravery.
That's powerful.
It is, and this brings the entire narrative full circle. On their final morning, before they break camp and head back to their normal lives, they return to Wells Cathedral for one last morning liturgy.
Wrapping it up where it started.
Right. And it is here that Bay synthesizes the entire experience around a core guiding verse for his sons.
Yeah, he points them to 1 Corinthians 16.32, which reads, "Watch, stand fast in the faith, act like men, be strong."
That verse perfectly encapsulates the thesis of his intentional fatherhood blueprint. It's about vigilance, foundational grounding, and taking decisive action.
Right.
And Bay provides an interesting update in a postscript to his essay. He notes that this Glastonbury reconnaissance mission was just a seed. He writes that the call later deepened into something much more costly, answering a summons to be what he calls God's mighty men.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this right now? Regardless of your own spiritual worldview, there's a fascinating universal mechanism at play in Bay's story.
There really is.
It begs the question, how do you intentionally design physical or mental challenges to build resilience in your own life? Or if you're a parent or a mentor, how do you curate experiences that purposefully push the people you care about from the safety of the campfire into the unknown dark of the woods?
That is the ultimate takeaway here. Bay's essay offers a deeply personal look at how historical spaces hold multiple fiercely contested identities.
Yeah.
But on a mechanical level, it is a masterclass in how a parent might actively use environment, history, and physical exertion to forge their children's worldviews rather than just letting culture dictate it to them passively.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We started with the quiet simplicity of first-time s'mores at an empty Cheddar Gorge campsite.
A great starting point.
We unpacked the psychological weight of rites of passage. We navigated the intense culture shock of dodging teas on a Halloween-fueled high street.
The teas, yeah.
And we witnessed an ancient historical clash of symbols atop Glastonbury Tor, ending with a perilous fading light climb up a rocky gorge to lock the lesson into muscle memory.
It is a vivid reminder that the physical landscapes we walk through every single day are layered with history, meaning, and often very quiet conflict. The ultimate meaning of a place is largely determined by what you choose to carry into it.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with to mull over. We've spent this entire deep dive talking about Joseph Bay physically reclaiming geographical spaces for his faith,
Right.
sweating, hiking, and carrying a heavy wooden cross up a hill in the real world. But in our modern hyper-connected era, are the most important reconnaissance missions really happening in physical places like Glastonbury anymore?
That's a great question.
Or have the most consequential battlegrounds for our kids' worldviews moved entirely into the digital spaces, the feeds, and the algorithms we scroll through every single day?
It's a profound question to consider. If the primary battlefield for the next generation's worldview is entirely digital, what does a modern digital cross even look like? And how do you carry it?
Exactly. So, the next time you are packing the car for what you think is just a quiet weekend getaway, ask yourself what unseen baggage or intentional missions you might be bringing along for the ride.
Always a good thing to think about.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep unpacking the stories and the histories around you, and we will see you next time.